It is 3 minutes after 10. Shall I break the habit of a lifetime and begin the programme with some texts that have already come in response to the breaking news regarding the Scottish independence referendum? Barry writes from Dumfries, Scotland, it has now been proved, is a prisoner that can never escape. Imagine the EU saying that the UK couldn't have their referendum. I joke. Well, I don't joke, but Barry then makes a joke that I don't understand, so I won't read it out in case it's naughty. Well, this has worked out well, wasn't it? Starting the show with texts. Honestly, it's probably a reason why there's a well-worn formula for putting a programme together. David writes, the English court shows how Scotland is being treated as a colony of England. We must break away from English colonial rule. And Moza writes, on the same theme, there is no legal route to independence. The UK is a prison, not a union. Those are just the first three texts to come in response to the news that the second Scottish independence referendum would need approval from Westminster. And there we are. So let me be clear. Sorry, I am actually going to be clear. I haven't suddenly become a Conservative politician. Let me be clear. This is not a radio phone-in programme about whether or not independence is desirable for Scotland or not, or indeed the entire United Kingdom. We are not having an independence phone-in. We will do. I mean, I like them. They're great, and it's fascinating, and it changes, and my own position on it has changed quite a lot as I have educated myself and been educated by you on some of the key points. I also think Brexit has changed it fairly I would say Brexit had changed it fairly significantly, but the numbers don't necessarily reflect that. So this is a phone-in about the referendum, not about what the result of the referendum you would like to see. And it's well, I suppose in a way it's also about the question of independence, because I think this is the worst possible thing that could have happened for unionists, oddly. I don't know, and this is where the cue to enlighten and illuminate me begins. I don't know that the SNP would really have relished the opportunity of winning this case. I could be wrong, but it would be messy to say the least, and it wouldn't have any meaningful resolve. I would argue, and I think a Scottish Tory conceded this recently, I would argue that any majority that the Scottish National Party enjoys in Holyrood is a mandate for another independence referendum. Given that their chief raison d'etre is to pursue independence for Scotland, it's always struck me as anomalous and confusing and possibly even sort of quite sinister that the mandate is somehow questionable while the SNP enjoy a majority in the Scottish Parliament. But hey-ho, what do I know? And then, of course, it would be an advisory referendum, which means that even if they got the result that they wanted, it wouldn't actually have weight, legal weight, constitutional weight. So if you're wondering why I'm pausing more than usual, it's because the story just broke and I hadn't actually given it much thought before 5 minutes to 10. I probably, well, do you know what I need? What I need is a forward planning department in my own head so that I can think what's likely to be happening at 10 o'clock today and do my reading up before I actually come on air. But, it's too late now. Here we are. Phone lines are open, by the way, if you want to put me out my misery. 0345 6060 973. And by misery and by thinking out loud, I guess what I mean is, I knew we were getting the news. I hadn't thought beyond what the news would mean because I didn't know what the news would be. So it could have gone either way. It therefore seemed to me unwise to start preparing for either decision, given that the polar opposite one could occur. I know what you're thinking. You could have prepared for both of them, James. But there, crikey, sue me. Honestly, it's time you did some work on this programme. Why is it always down to me to do the heavy lifting and all the research? So this is what I'm thinking. Judging by the text coming into the studio early doors, I think this is going to give a huge boost to the Scottish independence movement. The problem I have when I do phone-ins like this, which is why I tried a moment ago to stress that this is not a phone-in about independence itself, the problem I have is that the positions are so polarised and established. You tell me where you stand on independence itself, and I'll tell you where you stand on today's news. And that's the challenge that we face at 10 this morning. I'd like to have an interesting conversation. I'd like to have an enlightening conversation, not just about Scotland and possible independence, but about the very nature of the United Kingdom, about the very nature of the union itself. What does this mean? Because don't shoot me down yet, and stop telling me Brexit was an advisory referendum as well. I know it was, but it was also agreed in advance that the result would be binding, and I don't think that would have. Well, clearly that wouldn't have been the case, as I understand it, in the case of the referendum that would have happened if the Supreme Court hadn't just ruled that it won't. So, first thought is that telling Scotland that they can't make a decision like this themselves is a very strong argument for independence, a very strong argument for claims that they are somehow imprisoned or held hostage by the union. But for the rest of us, I can see the wisdom of the decision, actually, because it has to be a decision taken in the seat of the United Kingdom's government on whether or not you're going to have a referendum on whether or not the United Kingdom breaks up. So that's what I've been looking for. So there are the two arguments, I suspect. The one argument is the question of whether or not we vote on our own independence should be up to us and us alone. But actually, I can see some weight in the argument that the question of whether or not the United Kingdom breaks up should be a question posed by the United Kingdom, or at least with the permission of the government of the United Kingdom. That's not bad, actually, at 10 minutes after 10. I go from a cold start, from a standing start. I think that we've got right to the heart of this issue until a lawyer rings in and explains that I've got absolutely everything backwards. But there it is. So my struggles. Well, you may know my struggles with this issue in that I am British, and my Britishness entails. I don't feel when I'm in Scotland that I'm in a foreign country, and I don't. We're not going to talk about me today. I just know two things. As a Brit, I quite like the fact that Scotland is part of my home. But if I was Scottish, I'm pretty sure I'd be all in for independence, and probably would have been since childhood. I mean, the idea, I always think of that Proclaimers lyric. I don't understand why you let someone else rule your land, cap in hand. And knowing what I know about myself and my slightly, sometimes romantic views of politics and patriotism, I'm pretty sure that if I was Scottish, I'd be all in for independence. But I'm not, you see. I'm British, and therefore I'm torn on it, because while I recognise the power of the argument for it, I also would feel a sense of loss in the way that I imagine. Well, I don't think anybody really feels about the European Union in the same way. Well, some people may, but I don't. In the same emotional way that you might feel about the United Kingdom. So I was going to say, I imagine that some French people felt a profound sense of loss when we left the European Union. And that is probably true. I know it's true in some cases, but I can't quite emotionally see it in the same way that I would see Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. Do you see what I mean? It just feels like a tighter union to me. It feels like a bigger bond. It's a much older bond. It's a much deeper bond. And therefore breaking that bond would resonate with me as someone being divorced, if you like, more than I think your average Belgian would have felt about Brexit. But that, I think, is the nub of it. I think we've nailed it. You've got this question of who should decide whether or not the United Kingdom, whether or not part of the United Kingdom votes on breaking up the United Kingdom. Should it be a decision taken by the part that would break away, or should it be a decision taken by the whole entity that would be broken? And that's the conversation we're going to have. You see, should the whole of the EU have voted on Brexit? That question's just come in. That's not. one of us is misunderstanding the issue here. I think it's you. Because I'm not suggesting that everyone in the United Kingdom should have a vote on the referendum. I'm suggesting that the government of the United Kingdom... Well, no, I'm explaining that the court has concluded that the government of the United Kingdom has to give a green light to any referendum on the breakup of the United Kingdom. So I don't think we needed the European Union's permission to have a referendum, but under EU law, any member state can have a referendum whenever it wants on leaving. So your example, actually, rather than being a fly in the ointment of my thinking this morning, is actually an argument for my interpretation of the situation. The EU law allows EU members to have referendums on leaving whenever they want, whenever their own parliament decides it, under EU law. Under UK law, the UK has to have final say on whether or not there's going to be a vote in any part of the UK on whether or not the UK breaks up. And in direct response to that, almost straight out of the blocks, Annie texts to say, if it's a voluntary union, then surely either partner should have the right to break that agreement, which is a powerful argument as well. So I think, having demonstrated two things, I don't have all the facts at my fingertips this morning, but I do have a fairly decent ability to grasp issues as they develop and as they emerge. We shall throw the phone lines open. And look, two things going on here. Your immediate response to the news that Scotland cannot hold a second independence referendum without first getting the approval of the UK government. Your immediate response to that. And then the second question, simply, what is wrong with the idea of the United Kingdom government deciding whether or not there's going to be a vote on the United Kingdom breaking up? Which I think might be my position. And it has arrived almost exactly on time. 18 minutes after 10 is the time. So there we are. The Supreme Court, the UK Supreme Court, has ruled against the Scottish Parliament holding a new independence referendum in a judgment that is likely to anger Scottish nationalists who say that the country's future should be for Scottish voters to decide. But who should the UK's future be decided by? Or who should decide whether or not there can be a vote on the UK's future, if not the UK government? That's how I'm setting up the argument, all right? Don't throw anything at me yet. Peter's in Loch Lomond. Peter, what would you like to say?
I'd like to say that I'm devastated this morning, but I'm not surprised at the decision of the Supreme Court. I think it was always going to go that way as soon as Sturgeon decided to take the fight down that avenue.
Yes.
It's supremely undemocratic. It can't be seen or described as anything else. What are they frightened of? What are they frightened of happening?
Well, that's a rhetorical question, isn't it? I mean, they're frightened of a result for a yes vote for independence.
And beyond that, James, they're frightened of losing what Scotland has in terms of its resources and what it contributes at the moment.
That's not rhetorical. That is arguable. But in terms of why there would be reluctance to have a referendum, it's because it might deliver the result that they don't want, and that result would be Scottish independence. The whys and the wherefores of it is a conversation for another day.
Yeah. Well, I could go back as far as Dennis Healey, late in his career after he'd retired, admitted that if Labour then had been honest about the amount of oil that was under the North Sea...
Well, I've just literally said we're not having this debate today, Peter.
Okay.
We're not having a debate about why or why not independence would be good or bad for... We're having a debate about why the breakup of the United Kingdom, a vote on the breakup of the United Kingdom, shouldn't need the support of the government of the elected government of the United Kingdom.
Well, can we go back to 2014 and the actual referendum itself?
No. We're talking about today's news, breaking news. The UK government has the final say on whether any part of the UK is going to have a vote on breaking up the UK. What's wrong with that? How is that anti-democratic?
The point I was making was that people, before the referendum, people were told that this was the only way to stay in the European Union.
I've warned you three times. I've warned you three times now. We're not having a relitigation of the independence referendum. We're talking about why it is in any way wrong for the UK government to have the final say on whether or not any part of the UK will vote on breaking up the UK. Final chance.
This is a treaty of union, going back to 1707. It's the union of two parliaments. We're told that it's a union of equals. if it's a union of equals, then we have to have the democratic right to do what we want to do, which is to become independent.
How is it a union of two parliaments? Forgive me for being ignorant. When the Scottish Parliament is a relatively new phenomenon.
That's why it's called the United Kingdom, because in 1707 the parliaments came together.
Right.
Scotland was an independent nation that chose to go into partnership.
This is me being ignorant. I didn't know there was a Scottish Parliament in 1707. It was a union of monarchies, as I understood it. It was James VI ascending to the throne of England in addition to the throne that he already had in Scotland.
The Union of the Crowns was separate, but they were separate, but yes, ultimately related, inevitably.
That's interesting. You're not answering my question, though, which is
I think I am.
Okay, well, I'll put it on the board.
As a separate nation, then we should be able to decide now that we want to leave that partnership.
Yeah.
It's
for the record, I think I agree with you. I just think that for the purposes of this morning's conversation, we need to establish exactly why the United Kingdom government shouldn't have the final say on whether or not any part of the United Kingdom votes on leaving the United Kingdom.
Because they claim it's a union of equals, and therefore there should be an equal opportunity for either partner to secede from the union.
What would you point to first as proof that they claim it's a union of equals?
They've been saying that for hundreds of years.
Well, who has? I mean, because I've been saying it isn't a union of equals. It obviously isn't a union of equals, and that's why so many Scots want independence. So I don't quite see why you think that's a definitive.
No, I'm absolutely agreeing with you. They claim it's a union of equals.
But who do they, though? Who does? I never heard that claim.
The Westminster Parliament.
Really?
Boris Johnson, he's quoted.
Okay.
He keeps on telling us it's a union of equals and then acting in a way that disproves that.
Yeah, but Boris Johnson...
frustrating our democratic right.
If I'm asking you to prove something's true and you cite Boris Johnson as your example, you're in grave danger of doing the polar opposite, aren't you? That's the problem. I mean, I just want to examine that, and we will, because I don't recognise that, but then I don't understand these issues anywhere near as well as most Scottish people do. I've never thought that the Westminster... message, the Westminster position was that the union is a union of equals. I mean, maybe I'm just being stupid, but I don't see it that way in the way that you don't, Peter, and B, I don't understand that to be the position that Westminster has held for hundreds of years, because it's so demonstrably not true. Even if there is a long queue of people who say it, the simple fact that the Westminster Parliament has for hundreds of years made laws that people in Scotland are beholden to proves that it's not a union of equals, even after devolution. Gareth is in Chandler's Ford in Hampshire. Gareth, what would you like to say?
Oh, thank you very much for having me on, James. It's my first time on. I'm extremely nervous. I'm a nervous individual, so please excuse me. But
well, then I will be a lot less robust with you than I was with Peter, Gareth. Don't worry. Okay, I came out the blocks a bit quick there, I think.
Okay, there's three things I'd like to raise. The Articles of Union were an Anglo-Scottish decision, as I understand it from reading my history. I'm a bit rusty on it, but
okay.
It was a decision that both, it was wanted by both that we became Great Britain. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I feel that there's two other things that are really going to cost us all, and the first is the moving of Fowles Lane. Now, I quite understand the SNP.
Right, I'm going to pause you there. Not because you're in trouble or anything like that. I'm going to have to abandon my insistence that we don't relitigate the independence conversation, because Peter took 3 goes to understand what I was saying. You've come on next and you've gone straight in on one of the key bones of contention in the independence debate, regardless of the fact that I was trying to have a phone in exclusively about this morning's decision. So I'm just going to give up on that. You carry on. Okay.
That was okay. I just wanted to raise that as an issue, because the English taxpayer would have to foot the bill for that, and that's one of the reasons I feel the English should be included in this decision. So if we're going to have a referendum, let the English be equal partners in having that referendum.
Wow, so you'd go further than the Supreme Court. You'd say any future Scottish independence referendum should be voted on by everybody in the United Kingdom.
I feel it should be.
Do you think the French should have had a vote on Brexit?
That's a very different matter. This is a very old union that was decided on by both
I'm going to
parties
keep
as
asking you the
equals.
question.
Yes.
Do you think the French should have had a vote on Brexit?
Yes, I think they should.
Oh, you've got me!
I do. Yeah,
You
I
rascal!
do.
You rascal,
think-
Gareth! No, you don't.
I do actually.
Okay,
I hate
fair enough.
Brexit. I hate Brexit, but that's a separate issue. The second thing is
Yes.
the border and the vexed question of the SNP pledged to rejoin the European Union, which I fully understand. I hated leaving it. I hated it, but we've left it. Now, if they do have the border, that border will be a European border on the British mainland. I think that will be a nightmare for our economies. I think it'll be a nightmare for the country, the island that is Great Britain. It's something I'd hate to see in my lifetime. I fear it may happen, and it's something I'd hate to see. And I'd like to know who's going to pay for that border. That border will be as meaningful as a border across the island of Ireland.
I was about to say, and we've seen what happens when you try to sort of, more pertinently probably, the Irish Sea border that's been put in place by Brexit and the difficulties that's causing. Imagine if it was a land border running right across the middle of Great Britain.
Look at the mischief it's causing. I just feel these are things that need to be asked. They need to be out there now.
I don't disagree with you. I just didn't want to ask them today. But what you've done is, I think, very neatly, if you'd allow me to say so, and very calmly illustrate why I was being an idiot when I was hoping to have this conversation without bringing in some of the bigger questions about future independence. It was a little bit... At the very best, it was naive of me. At the very worst, it was pig ignorant. So thank you for... Thank you for setting me straight, Gareth.
Thank you. I'm very passionate about us remaining together. I love Scotland, and I love the Scottish people, and I would hate for a border to exist between us. I'd just like to say that. I respect all of them very greatly, and I think Nicola Sturgeon is an amazingly eloquent leader who is putting forward a very forceful point, and I can see everything that's going. I can understand everything. I'm cursed with understanding both sides, and I do feel that it would be a retrograde step. It would be a retrograde step, in my opinion, but I think the debate is excellent to have, and I'm glad you've opened it up now, James. I think it's the right thing to do. But,
well, thank you.
Thank you, Sweet.
No, that was a brilliant debut, Gareth. Really, did you enjoy it?
I'm very, very nervous, James, very nervous, but I will ring in again. I'm a great admirer of yours. I'm not just being a creep here. I love the way you put forward your arguments. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. I love debuts like that. And the fact that Gareth felt compelled to join in despite his nerves. It's a compliment to all of us, I think. Not least because I was a bit like a bear with a sore head with Peter in Loch Lomond on the previous call, which doesn't necessarily roll out the red carpet for people who are feeling a bit anxious. As I own my ignorance, though, let me confirm that the Act of Union was passed by the English and Scottish Parliaments in 1707. This is one of the prices you pay for having a grade A in A-level history that focused exclusively on the Byzantine era and the reign of Charlemagne. So that is why my history, my British history, is nowhere near as good as it should be. 10:30 is the time. Holly Harris is here with the headlines. 10:35 is the time. Let's do some texts, which I've sort of started recently coming back from breaks with a few texts. I don't know whether it's going to stay, whether I'll even remember that I currently quite like it as a tool on the programme, but it's helpful. Not least because it brings more voices to the programme, even if they're using my voice. James, how can you even have this discussion when you come from a position of utter ignorance about Scotland and our history? 40 million, well, I think the short answer to that question is so that I will be less ignorant by the end of the discussion. That's reasonable, isn't it? It's already working. 10:35 is the time. 40 million voters in England, he goes on, consistently vote Tory, so Scotland will forever be burdened with whatever England wants. The answer to your question is this. The Westminster government is predominantly voted for by English constituencies. Guess how they're going to vote in a referendum about the union? It doesn't end here, be assured of that. Listen, I really enjoyed the last call, and I thought he was a very articulate and thoughtful chap, but I completely disagree with him about there being a country-wide vote, a United Kingdom-wide vote on Scottish independence. Just to be absolutely clear, that's not conversation or a debate that we're having today, and possibly, I'm not sure we'll ever actually have it. Mark's in Aberdeen. I'm a unionist, but I accept another referendum is inevitable if the SNP keep winning. The question is one of timing. The 2014 referendum literally ripped Scotland apart, including my own family, and the wounds have not healed. The current constitutional tension is serving its purpose. We can't hold a referendum every few years. A generation needs to pass, or a significant shift in polling. Again, I would add to that, as an outsider who has no skin in the game, I would add to that a profounder shift in the settlement as Brexit represents. But you would probably disagree, I sense, Mark. Sean's in Dundee. Sean, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Also, first-time caller. I just want to start off with a couple of points that Gareth mentioned.
Yes.
He spoke about, the union being a relationship that was entered into by two parties voluntarily.
Yes.
Both had a stake in that. I think getting into that line of argument is actually quite dangerous, because starting relationships and ending relationships is fundamentally different.
Also, there was no referendum on the union, was there, in 1707?
Well, no, and democracy looked fundamentally different and probably wasn't very democratic.
It's a very strong counter. And in fact, if you read Parcel of Rogues by Robbie Burns, you possibly get an idea of where popular feeling may have lay had anyone bothered to find out.
Well, yeah. And if you could imagine a world where, a society where, take marriage, for example, needed to have consent of both parties with no other way of petitioning it, it would just be awful. So I don't think that's a good line of support. Yeah. I think what I want to talk about is democratic deficit. And, if you look at I don't accept that anyone apart from Scotland should have a say in what this decision looks like. However, if that is the line of questioning that people want to go down, my counter-argument to that would be, what does that look like? Because there is a fundamental democratic deficit across the UK just now. As one of your texters pointed out, there are more English constituencies than any other constituency, even if you combine them. So England has 533 constituencies, Scotland has 59. That's nearly 10 times as many. It's impossible for Scotland to win an argument in that kind of context. So do we move down a federalist side? I think the other point to make is that without some sort of English devolution, bearing in mind that England doesn't have a parliament, there only exists the UK parliament, how do they have that voice? What is the discussion there? And I think just to add to that, I know we're not getting into litigating.
No, I've given up on that. I think that was foolish of me, not just naive, but also daft. Yet more evidence of my. That I come to this subject a lot less well equipped than I come to most other subjects.
Well, I think you're doing a pretty good job. I've tried to avoid that. I think that the other point I would make is, I had been an independent supporter from 2014 right up until Brexit and COVID. The uncertainty that those two mega events have placed on society has made me think a little bit harder about the timing of something like this. Yes. However, today's decision has swung me back in completely the opposite direction.
I completely understand why. I'd be exactly the same if I was in your boots.
I still want to know what is the democratic process for the people of Scotland who currently have a parliament that represents them, that is in favour of Scottish independence and having a referendum. What is the democratic process in doing that? And until somebody answers that question, I think that we can't move on from this at all. It's not we'll just stop talking about it.
I think that's the one thing we can all agree on. This isn't putting anything to bed, not for 5 minutes, never mind 5 years. And in fact, as you were speaking, Kevin texted to say, James, this is a bombshell moment. It's akin to throwing petrol on the bonfire of independence. And you're a bit inflamed today, clearly.
Yeah, to say the least.
I'm glad we're getting there, and thank you for your kind words. I really do passionately defend myself against the accusation that my own lack of deep understanding is a reason why we shouldn't have the conversation. I passionately believe the opposite is true, not least because over the years we've assembled such an astonishing audience that I can guarantee the quality of callers will make up for any deficits, as Sean was talking about, democratic deficits. Let's talk about knowledge deficits on the part of this particular presenter. Chantal is in Hull. What would you like to say, Chantal?
Hi, good morning, James.
Hello.
I am flabbergasted, or was flabbergasted when you began. I thought, is he serious?
What? What have I done now?
I couldn't believe that you would say that, oh, God.
What? Tell me what you think I said. I can't believe you're flabbergasted. I have done nothing today to flabber your ghast. Or indeed to ghast your flabber.
It was just like, I was like, okay, I have no skin in the game at all. But if you're in something, if you really want to get out of something, like if you're in a really controlling, toxic marriage,
Yes.
and someone says to you, "No, you can't get out."
I see. You need the permission of the other person.
Yeah, it's like, what the heck? I
don't think I was
blown
saying
away.
that. I do understand why your ghast was flabbered, but I think what I was saying would be more that you have to have a divorce law, and the divorce law has a source, and it comes from a place. And in the context of a referendum on breaking up the United Kingdom, the source, the place that legislation comes from would have to be the government of the Parliament of the United Kingdom. That's all I was suggesting. So I think you can unflabber your ghast now.
Okay, I will unflabber my ghast,
Good.
but I will say this.
Yes.
Scotland and the Scottish people have the right to have a voice on how they are ruled.
Yeah.
If they want to leave or break up the union, they should have a right to have a referendum.
It's nuts,
And
isn't it? The more you think about it.
It is. I mean, the United Kingdom became a United Kingdom under Queen Mary in 1707. And that's a long time, and a lot of changes. A lot of changes have happened. And if I was Scottish, I would be spitting feathers right now.
Nails. Spitting feathers means you're thirsty.
Oh, well, yeah, I'll be thirsty for a glass of water that is not muddy.
I'm only correcting you because I made that mistake for about 10 years before someone set me straight on it. Spitting nails is when you're angry. Spitting feathers is when you're... or maybe I've got that wrong as well. I'm making a flipping habit of it today, Chantal. You think your ghast is flabbered, honestly. I'm just reading about the history of the Scottish Parliament going back to the 14th century. Shows what I know. But I know more than I did... It's not even mystery hour. I know more than I did 43 minutes ago, a lot more. And look, here's the thing, and this might upset some people, some unionists, but and I know lots of people vote for the SNP who clearly are not actually desirous of independence or passionately desirous of independence. The numbers don't support the idea that every SNP vote would automatically translate into an independence vote. But how can you justify this continuing refusal to allow the people of Scotland to have a say on their own future? And don't cite the last referendum as they did, and it was done for a generation, because subsequent to that, the people of England essentially handcuffed themselves to Scotland and drove the car off a cliff. And whether you're ready to admit that yet or not as a Brexiter, I'm afraid you simply can't point back to the 2014 referendum as being definitive or settled, because 2 years later, a Conservative government in an English parliament pursued a course of such utter idiocy that Scotland ended up, against its will, being dragged out of the biggest single market in the world. Scotland ended up against its will. Good God, if the United Kingdom is the first country in history to have voted to impose economic sanctions on itself, Scotland must be the first country in history to have had economic sanctions imposed upon it by a vote of its so-called union ally. Madness. I mean, genuine madness, actually. I'm doing it a lot at the moment. I'm trying too hard to be balanced. It's my curse. But I just imagine for a moment that I was James McBrien instead of James O'Brien. And my goodness me, today's result would be sending me it'd be sending me loopy. How dare you? How dare you? But how much of that is built upon my utterly evidence-based dislike of the current iteration of the Conservative Party? Imagine, seriously, having to look to Westminster from Scotland and to see Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and the rest of them making an absolute dog's dinner of pretty much everything, while also being told, no, we're in charge of you. And people like Jacob Rees-Mogg standing up in the House of Commons to claim that it's a union of equals, and then not being able to name the Secretary of State for Wales, who's in his own cabinet. Got that off my chest. It's 10:45. It is 10:49. It is, I suspect, proof of Kevin's point. This decision that Scotland cannot hold a second independence referendum without first getting the approval or permission of the UK government, which is clearly not forthcoming and quite possibly never will be. I don't know what Keir Starmer's position is on this. The Labour Party currently in the process of firming up the policy platform on which they'll fight the next general election. You can only say one thing for certain. It's not going to bear much resemblance to the policy platform on which they fought the last general election. And given that that was the worst election defeat since 1935, why would it? But it doesn't mean that you will prefer necessarily to the last, or you'll be particularly approving of whatever they do come up with. But I find the idea of there being another referendum something that both party leaders would find very difficult to contemplate, whether Tory or Labour. 10:50 is the time. George is in Leicester. George, what would you like to say?
Good morning, sir. Yes, I was just calling in to say that I'm actually writing my PhD on this subject as to whether or not democracy has an input on whether or not we should allow them to ask the question.
Okay, well, specific to the Scottish referendum question, your PhD?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
So I'm both Canadian and British, so for me it's both Quebec and Scotland that are of interest.
Yes, of course.
And, that was mentioned this morning in the decision.
So Lord Reid, the decision essentially casts Scotland in the same status as Quebec, I think.
In terms of their reliance on the international interpretation of self-determination, yes.
Yeah.
The issue here is that it's an uncomfortable intersection between politics and law. So the Supreme Court has to rely on interpreting the Scotland Act from 1998. All they're empowered to do here, unlike let's say the United States Supreme Court, they can't overrule Parliament. And the Act in 1998 clearly sets out that it is a reserved power with regards to the Union and the sovereignty of the UK Parliament. The problem is, though, is that we're also a democracy, and there's politics involved here. It makes it very clear from a matter of international law that self-determination outside of the extremes of decolonization or gross violations of human rights and humanitarian law, that self-determination is normally fulfilled within the constitutional framework of the existing state.
Right.
And the UK, like Canada and like any other state that, holds itself with a representative electorate, like a representative government that represents all the people and doesn't discriminate, they have the right to rely on international law for territorial integrity and political unity.
Yes.
But that comes from the Friendly Relations Declaration, what they call the Saving Clause. And the issue there is that relates to interference from outside of the state. Where it becomes uncomfortable is when the people calling for tearing a section of the country out comes from within the state, and that's where democracy comes in. So the question and this is the focus of my PhD, is in a democracy where there's a majority support, it becomes difficult to say that you cannot hold that vote. By comparison, and you were mentioning this earlier with regards to rather than being O'Brien, being McBrien.
Yes.
With regards to the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement, there is the possibility of a reunification poll if there appears to be, at the discretion of the Minister of Northern Ireland, a majority support to hold one. We don't have that for Scotland. And within the United Kingdom, we have two different regimes. Now, it may not be advantageous to have that constitutionalized, to have it written into the rules. But at the same time, you also mentioned the fact that it's probably going to boost the SNP mandate in Scotland. The problem is that you're also right in saying that they represent more than just the independence question. It's also the governance of Scotland. And the question becomes, can an election of the SNP be a clear mandate to hold the referendum? And that's a particularly different question from a clear mandate to separate.
Yeah, of course it is.
Following Quebec, there has to be a clear majority with a clear answer to a clear question, and
which you can only get with a referendum.
Correct, and that I think is correct. I mean,
God,
I don't just think that's right.
You should do a PhD on this stuff, George.
Trying to get it done, James. Trying to get it done.
I feel your pain. And in fact, I mean, you preempt, as I'm sure you know, Nicola Sturgeon's next card, which is that they will treat a future election as a de facto referendum, which actually is probably not justifiable under the analysis you've just shared.
Unfortunately, yeah, it's an overcomplication because a manifesto for an election includes policies such as bin collection and funding for schools, which isn't necessarily a constitutional question. That's a regular, electoral question that we ask about certain policies. I mean, you were saying that the other day about Keir Starmer's speech.
Yes, exactly.
Is it politics or is it policy?
Yeah.
The two are very different things.
They certainly are, although much of the media pretends not to understand that. Do you have to, as you complete your PhD, do you have to arrive at a thesis? Do you have to arrive at a conclusion?
You've hit the nail on the head of the problem. Yeah, it's very difficult.
Yeah, because I was about to ask you what it is, but obviously you don't know yet.
No,
do you?
As I write, as the facts change, you change your mind.
Yes.
And as I keep reading through, I mean, there's a lot of advocates that suggest that democracy plays a very heavy role in this. The democratic legitimacy, which was mentioned in the decision this morning.
Yes.
Democratic legitimacy is a very important part of keeping the political unity together. And the issue is that the Supreme Court will never provide the answer. In fact, part of my PhD suggests that you should do everything in your power and in your planning for any such pursuits to avoid having it go to a court because it seems less democratic. It's more technocratic from a legal perspective.
Gosh, yes. But actually, it does have the air of a sort of being handed down to the plebs, doesn't it, from an august bench?
It's a lesser quality of democracy.
Beautifully put. You clearly listen to the program quite a lot, so you're familiar with the highest accolade I can pay to a caller. I hope, George, are you?
Oh, I don't deserve it until
you
PhD
do.
is done. Please don't.
Oh, you do.
Oh, you're a good man.
I'm Ray Liotta, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. If you build it, they will come.
Take care, mate, and ring me again, especially if we're discussing these issues. What an absolute legend. And there it is. So how can James talk about this issue when he knows so little about it? That's why. Every call today, but George in Leicester, straight to the top of the class. Absolutely stunning analysis. And that is a lovely moment. I'll remember that. I'm going to say, is there a thesis? Is there a conclusion at the end of your PhD? We could actually just phone George. Okay, what do we do next? And that beautiful admission that's the problem. That's why it's not finished. And of course, nor is the independence debate itself. Will it ever be? Etty's in Kentish Town. Etty, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Pretty tough act to follow there.
That's why I'll move so quickly to the next call, so you can spare my own meanderings.
No, so I'll do my best.
Thank you.
I was just going to say, sort of, to some of your earlier callers debating whether the rest of the UK should have a say on the referendum or not, or should be voting in it. I'm of the opinion, generally speaking, they shouldn't, like Belgium shouldn't or France shouldn't. But I think what is very important to remember in any referendum that happens in the future is that the rest of the UK will have a huge say in Scottish independence and the terms of that relationship and what that will look like.
As in the deal, the withdrawal agreement or whatever we call it.
Exactly. Yes. In the same way that the French people didn't get to vote on Brexit, but they got to dictate, 80% of the terms of it. Yeah. And I think that will be the same thing.
The terms of the future relationship, rather than for people about to start jump up and down, they had nothing to do with Brexit, but they obviously the future relationship between the European Union and the United Kingdom is going to be largely, ideally 50-50, but obviously the weight of numbers.
And the same thing will happen, in the event of Scottish independence, probably with the rest of the UK and Scotland. And I think, it's important to be honest about that when
it is.
Independence debate is had, because that democratic deficit still exists.
Do you know,
for Scottish people?
Of course it does. Of course, and it won't actually solve some of the grievances that will lead or might lead to independence. It will exacerbate and prove them, even as independence is achieved, which is a really anomalous, or at least strange. Disheartening is a great word. Do you know what you've done? It's amazing, this hour. It's one of the best hours we've done in ages, which, considering I made such a pig's ear of the top of it, is an absolute testament to the callers and the producers putting people through to the studio. But you've gone now. You've taken us to the polar opposite position from where I started, trying to conduct this conversation in a way that ignored and deliberately ignored all the other arguments surrounding independence and tried to look exclusively at responses to the judgment this morning, you've gone completely to the opposite extreme, haven't you, and said you can't have this conversation without thinking not just about the other independents, but also about what happens after independence.
Exactly. It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense. I can only apologise.
No, not at all. We all try.
We do. We all do our best. Oh, boy. Every day's a school day. Thank you, Etty. Thank you, everybody. That was absolutely vintage. It really was. From very, very, very dodgy beginnings to absolute, from a manky little acorn, we grew a magnificent oak together. Up next, probably striking, probably industrial action, probably a question about whether or not Mick Lynch was right this morning when he told Nick Ferrari that the air of support for industrial action is abroad, that there is a warmer attitude to the RMT in particular perhaps, and the trade union movement in general than there has been before. And I will bring into it a report on a well-known clothing retailer apparently having appalling working conditions for their staff. 4 minutes after 11 is the time. Dr. Martin here is saying, James just said every day's a school day. I've never heard that phrase before, but what a great attitude for learning every day. Well, you know what they say, Martin, every day's a school day. And this came in from Tim, which I just thought was absolutely lovely. I can't find it on my screen, but I just took a photograph of it to send to a mate. So I've got it on my own phone. James, I don't think, says Tim in Highgate, anything makes me quite as happy as when a Ray Liotta is awarded outside of Mystery Hour. It's a moment, isn't it? I apologise if you don't know what that was all about. You will do if I can tempt you to stick around and listen more. But the Ray Liotta obviously is the clip of the late great Ray Liotta, very kindly recording what had become the programme's catchphrase, usually during Mystery Hour, when someone rings in with an answer that involves qualifications almost impossible to believe that they happen to be listening on the day that question got asked. But it does occasionally reach into the parts of the programme that are not Mystery Hour, and when we get a caller who is supremely qualified to contribute to a conversation, either from their identity, we're having a phone in about someone in the news and the person in the news rings in. I don't always do a Ray Liotta in those circumstances because I'd feel a bit silly, or through qualifications. And George in Leicester there, doing a PhD, almost smack in the middle of the conversation that we were trying to have, and were having, indeed, about this ruling and about Scottish independence in general. So a thing of absolute beauty. I'm with Tim in Highgate. I think they're among my favourite moments on the programme as well. I also like it when I read two apparently different stories in the news of a morning and recognise that they are actually intrinsically linked. And it's not, I don't think, self-aggrandising to suggest that many media outlets won't acknowledge the intrinsic link between these two stories. The Daily Mail, for example, has on its front page, "When will we rein in the unions intent on Christmas chaos?" The Times publishes a report today about the fashion giant Boohoo, alleging that workers there in a giant warehouse in Lancashire are forced to walk the equivalent of a half marathon every shift in a sweltering warehouse where at night-time temperatures can reach 32 degrees centigrade. The Times have put a journalist undercover there for a month, fulfilling online orders at the retailer's warehouse in Lancashire, and has recorded complaints from staff there of racism, sexual harassment, grueling targets, inadequate training and ill-fitting safety equipment. The conditions have led to workers collapsing in the aisles, with an ambulance being called to the site on average once a month. It's a British company and it enjoys sales of nearly £2 billion a year. The reporter walked up to 13 miles a shift, which is more than 3 times the average amount that the company has previously claimed that staff are required to cover. There is loads. It's an astonishing report. I'm just moving to the end of it because obviously I would have to quote what Boohoo have said in response to this. Making sure our people are safe and comfortable in their workplace is our highest priority. They also said they had an employee engagement program, and our colleagues tell us that they are happy in their work environment. That's how a spokeswoman for Boohoo responded to these allegations and indeed this report, concluding, "We also offer a free on-site gym." Listen, if you're walking 13 miles per shift, I don't think you need an on-site gym, lads. Just a thought, but, what do I know? A subsidised canteen and multiple breakout areas to help colleagues relax. So those two stories are intrinsically linked, aren't they? Why is the Daily Mail getting angry about railway workers going on strike and not publishing regular front pages about the appalling terms and conditions endured by workers legally sometimes and illegally at other times in the United Kingdom? Why do you think that is? Now, what would be the single best and most proven way for workers at this boohoo plant in Lancashire to protect themselves from apparently exploitative employers? Any thoughts on that? Anybody? Any Daily Mail columnists want to ring in and offer up some ideas on how a workforce enduring unbearable treatment from an employer might ensure better terms and conditions, possibly even higher pay? If only there was some sort of organisation that allowed collective bargaining. If only there was some sort of leverage that workers could exercise. Like, for example, I don't know, imagine if they could withdraw their labour and therefore perhaps take some small bites out of the £2 billion a year sales that their employer enjoys. Hang on, that's three things there. They could come together and practice collective bargaining, culminating in the actual or a threat of withdrawal of labour until such time as the employer stops requiring them to work in, unbearable circumstances heat-wise, stops requiring them to walk 13 miles per shift, and stops requiring them to work in 32-degree heat. Imagine a world in which workers could do that. Wouldn't that be incredible? Well, you don't have to imagine it, because that world exists if you're a member of the RMT. And that threat to withdraw labour is the way that trade unions can bring employers to the table, and indeed governments, depending on which sector it is that we're talking about, in pursuit of better terms and conditions, job protection and higher wages. But the pendulum can swing too far. Of course it can. Unions, oddly, and there is some history of this, although nowhere near as much as some accounts would pretend, unions can exercise so much leverage on an employer that they actually end up almost collectively bargaining their way out of a job. Because the employer can't sustain the demands of the union, and therefore the business becomes unviable. That is not a common occurrence, but neither is it an impossible one. You'd look perhaps to Arthur Scargill as an example of what can happen to an industry when a union flexes its muscles too much or takes too much industrial action. That's a very simplistic analysis of the miners' strike, and it's quite possible that that Margaret Thatcher and I think, was it Francis Pym? I forget who her ideological mentors were, that Thatcher was up for the destruction of the mining industry from pretty much the start of that strike. So the idea that the longevity of it and the temerity of the NUM was the reason is a bit naive, but I'm using it as a simplistic illustration of the other extreme of exploited workers coming together to achieve better terms and conditions. So it's there, right? I mean, it's incredible to reflect that the best-selling newspapers in the country are committed to attacking, whenever the opportunity arises, the only means by which an ordinary worker can protect herself from exploitative employers. It is objectively incredible. You know, I'm obsessed with the idea of right-wing media persuading populations, this population, to act against its own members, to literally to act against its own interests. Look at Brexit. To literally vote, to slap ourselves in the face with a manky old mackerel and then dance around for 6 years claiming that it was some sort of victory for national interest. Bonkers, but beyond bonkers. And here it is again in microcosm. What do you feel about unions? I'm opposed to them. What do you feel about workers having some ability to stand up to their employers and demand better wages, perhaps in line with inflation during an epic cost of living crisis? Oh no, I'm in favour of that. How are you going to do it without a union? Oh no, I don't like unions. Well, how are you going Oh, never mind. Just get back to the TV guide, go and do the crossword. And so let's examine the pendulum again today, okay? 0345 6060973. Helpfully, the Daily Mail tells us that the RMT, ASLEF and the TSSA rail unions are all pursuing pay rises with a threat of industrial action. In fact, 8 days of strikes could go ahead over the Christmas period. I mean, they have to concede the industrial strife is being driven by demands for wage rises that match, and they add or exceed, which is a little cheeky. Let's focus on the match. Sky-high inflation. They get the phrase sky-high into the coverage, even though it's the inflation that's sky-high. You're literally asking for a wage that stays the same in real terms as the one that you're currently on now. An inflation matching increase in your wages means that you will be exactly the same as you are now in terms of how much money you've got left after you've paid all your bills. How dare they demand parity with where they were last year financially? Nurses are looking for a 17% pay hike, which is higher than inflation, but you have to look at how long ago it was they got the last one. So, parity with where they were 5 years ago as opposed to where they were 1 year ago. The rise is fair because an experienced nurse's salary has actually fallen 20% in real terms since 2010. Now, I know we've just invented trade unions when we were wondering out loud about what workers could possibly do if they were being required to work in appalling conditions. Can anyone remember what happened in 2010 that may have had some bearing upon the 20% dip in nurses' salaries since then? Was there a political event of any kind? It's so hard to remember, so hard to keep all this information in one head. I think that's why we work best together. Can anyone remember? Oh yeah, the Tories got into power at a time when job patient satisfaction with the NHS was at the highest it had ever been. Civil servants are looking for 10% for around 100,000 workers, i.e. roughly in line with inflation. They are looking at month-long targeted strikes from the middle of next month if the government refused to pay them enough money to keep their current financial situation in place. Postal workers at the CWU want pay rises for 115,000 Royal Mail workers in line with inflation. They've been offered 9, including a 7% salary increase over 2 years and a lump sum payment of 2% this year. 2% this year, but the CWU has rejected that, announcing 11 days of walkouts on various dates between November the 24th and Christmas Eve. So railways and Royal Mail striking in the run-up to Christmas are going to be disruptive. So let's go back to the questions we were asking at the top of this introduction about leverage. What's the point of having leverage if it doesn't work? So again, the argument, I can't believe they're doing it at Christmas, is saying, I can't believe they've actually got some influence. I can't believe they've actually got power. Teachers and lecturers, security staff at the GMB union as well. So loads of areas of life in the UK where workers are preparing to take industrial action in pursuit, most obviously, it's a bit more complicated on the railways, but most obviously in pursuit of pay rises that will allow them their income to keep track with their outgoings. Down with that sort of thing. 16 minutes after 11 is the time. The question that I want you to answer now is this. How can anyone be opposed to them? I apart from selfishness. I've got no one looking out for me, so why should they have anyone looking out for them? I first discovered this mindset with pensions. I'd do the newspaper reviews when I was a kid on Sky and places like that, and so there'd be someone there from the Mail or from the Murdoch media, and they'd say something like, well, lots of people in the private sector don't have pensions, so why should people in the public sector have pensions? And I always thought, even then, as a naive, wet behind the ears young showbiz journalist who'd been inexplicably invited on to telly to talk about the grown-up news, I used to sit there and think, well, that's a bit like saying I got mugged last night, so I won't be happy until you've been mugged as well. I got punched in the face last Tuesday. You've never been punched in the face, have you? How dare you try and protect yourself from being punched in the face? I've been punched in the face. Why should these firefighters have pensions? I haven't got a pension. Talk about divide and rule. So traditionally, radio phone-in programs are quite negative about trade unions because traditionally they're sort of conducted from quite a right-wing perspective. But I think we've turned that oil tanker around over the last few years, haven't we, you and I? Let's see what happens today. If you think that trade unions are the enemy, and you can make a case for claiming that without referencing the 1970s, when you either weren't alive or certainly weren't paying full attention to what was going on, then call me now. Why should we? Why should we be opposed to people and organisations and industries that exist essentially to prevent people from being put through the sort of experiences that these workers at the Boohoo warehouse in Lancashire are experiencing on a daily basis? 0345 6060 973. What do you think about strikes? Have I oversimplified it? Have I misrepresented it? Have I appallingly manipulated the conversation? What do you think about these strikes in particular on the railways, among nurses, civil servants, postal workers, security staff, teachers and lecturers, and strikes in general? Okay, that's the question. And I'll just, if I may, distill it further. Is Mick Lynch right when he talks of public support for industrial action in a way that I don't remember seeing in my professional lifetime? Has something changed? And if so, why? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. Sorry, that was a particularly long introduction. I don't know why, but if you want to... if you want me to stop talking, then ring in and answer the question. 0345 6060 973. What do we think about strikes? And is Mick Lynch right to suggest that there is something afoot at the moment about the relationships between workers and employers that means support for organisations that protect and promote the interests of workers is, after years of Thatcher, Murdoch attacks upon the very principle, the oil tanker is now turning around. 23 after 11 is the time. And the question of strikes. What do we think about them in general? What do we think about the looming ones in particular? And I think crucially, what do we think about Mick Lynch's suggestion? The General Secretary of the RMT did a brilliant full disclosure, by the way, if you haven't listened to it. I really recommend that you do. One of my favourites of the year so far. And I love them all, as you know. Never done a Duff one yet. I should not have said that out loud. Should I? Well, if we do a Duff one, we won't release it. So there we go, we're golden. Never done a Duff one yet and never will. So I think he's right, but who knows? How can you tell? Is there a sense that the oil tanker of anti-union rhetoric in this country, launched and very, very carefully steered through the public interest by successive governments, starting with Margaret Thatcher's, but mostly, of course, by the ambitions and hunger of Rupert Murdoch? I don't know. Let's find out. Maria's in Liverpool. What do you think, Maria?
Hi, James. First-time caller to you. So
welcome.
Thank you. Right. First question. I wholeheartedly agree with strikes. A strike is a person who has the only thing they've got really to bargain with, which is their labour. Their labour does not belong to the state. Their labour does not belong to the employer. Their labour belongs to them. And in a time of calm, people will happily go to work to do a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. But we haven't got that at the moment.
No, we haven't.
We haven't got that at the moment. You've got stories. And as for the second question about do the public back the strikes?
Yeah.
Yes, they do.
Well,
I believe.
I realised as I asked that question that it's a bit of a pointless one, isn't it? Because we're all going to claim that the public agree with us on this.
Well, you've only got to read of people, and it's been well known for months and months now, eat or eat, children going to school hungry, people who have children who can't afford to take them to hospital for chemo, I read this morning.
Yeah, it's another front page you've reminded me. A doctor's warning, poverty is forcing sick people to keep going to work. So, I mean, really the question should be, how can anybody ever be opposed to trade unions, particularly in a country like this one at this time?
Yeah, exactly. It's not a question of, in the 70s, and I lived through the 70s, and it was rampant pay rises that caused inflation. And they keep going back to the 70s. No.
Do they still? Because do they still? I mean, because it's 50 years ago now. Is that still the best they've got? The winter of discontent.
So. Yeah, I
Crikey.
think so. But now it's not companies making profits. It's companies profiteering on the back of working people.
Yeah.
That's what it is now. And the only way that can be stopped, because we've got a government who's run by the ERG. I mean, they're just the puppets on the front bench. You know, the government is run by the ERG because all their policies are based on keeping the workers down and making money.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to stop you there because I hold no torch for the ERG, but they are far too crackers to be running the government. They exert enormous pressure on issues related to Brexit and immigration, but they certainly had nothing to do with Jeremy Hunt's budget, which almost all of them would have absolutely hated, whereas they were probably jumping up and down with joy about Kwasi Kwarteng's because they don't really understand anything. So they're not quite the malevolent force in British politics that you describe because they're all so stupid.
And I think there's quite a few clever people in there.
Do you?
But,
who?
I do.
Who? Answer the question. Who?
No.
Right, who? A clever member of the ERG? You'd be better off looking for hen's teeth, Maria.
Oh, James, you put me on the spot now. First time caller, and you put me on the spot.
I won't. I'm not going to hold your feet to the fire on that one. Maybe there is a clever one. But yeah, I mean, briefly then, looking back over that period, back to the 70s, how has the demonisation of trade unions been so successful? Why has it been so successful?
Well, it came about with Thatcher, really, didn't it? After the 70s, well, at the end of the 70s came Thatcher, and her determination to smash the unions, to take control of people's labour. I mean, that was what that, and that was.
But that's not an answer because
well.
I don't get it. I watched it a bit. I mean, I wasn't really paying attention until I started this job, to be honest with you. But quite how you persuade people to be opposed to something that supports them, how you persuade people to be in favour of attacks upon their own interests is of enduring fascination to me. And that never is it more apparent. And in trade unions, I suppose the more people who lose the protection of a trade union, the easier it becomes to argue that trade unions are bad because I haven't got one. But apart from that slightly weird, selfish position, I just don't get it, Maria. I don't understand how you persuade a whole population of workers that organisations dedicated to protecting workers are somehow the enemy.
Fear, Project Fear.
Project Fear.
If you back a union, you will lose your job. Project Fear.
So we're back to Tufton Street and the idea that the only way to run a country is to let employers do whatever the hell they want.
Exactly. And this is why I think people have woken up to this fact now. And I think because people do have to choose, as the story today,
yes, should
I take my child to hospital for treatment, or should I stay at home and heat the house to keep him warm? When it gets to that level, it's a very, very personal level. It's not like I'm striking to get more money.
I hope you're right. No, it is. I'm striking for the most basic, of care and provision. But I hope you're right. I just worry as a student of these things that if they get the invitation to start hating right, then even the most powerful testimony and evidence that things are horribly wrong will be turned into a blame game with scapegoats queuing up to take it. It's not working, I don't think, with the unions, despite the best efforts of the right-wing media, possibly because it's not something that's infested social media particularly. I could be wrong about this, but it's not like, the stuff that really Auntie Doris is getting off Facebook rather than the Daily Mail. I'm obsessed with right-wing media in this country, but the real damage, the real poison is often poured into people from their social media connections and interactions. So maybe that's part of this phenomenon of warmth towards trades unions, even as their strikes disrupt our lives. If you think I'm exaggerating, we would once have talked about trades unions well within living memory in the same way that members of the media currently talk about Extinction Rebellion protesters. And I don't currently think that's happening. But of course, Maria and me could both be wrong. Holly Harris is here now with your headlines. It's 25 to 12. Theo's on the way, of course. PMQs coming up at 12. Back to the normal circumstances after last week's clash of the deputies. It will be Keir Starmer on one side, Sir Keir Starmer on one side, and Rishi Sunak on the other. I wonder what will be coming up. We shall find out, or at least we'll have a little think about it and then find out. Before that, I don't know I've got the question bang on this. There's plenty of people waiting to contribute, so we've got something right. But I am fascinated by the psychology of acting against your own self-interest. So clearly, if I say to you trades unions and you go, grrr, you don't think you are acting against your own self-interest. You see yourself as a victim of industrial action rather than a beneficiary of it. And that is perfectly sensible, because, if you're not on strike and you can't get to work because the trains aren't running, you are a victim of industrial action, not a beneficiary of it. But I guess for this to really work, everybody has to feel that they could be a beneficiary of industrial action. And as we're a much less unionised population than we have been in the past, although we're still probably more unionised than you'd think. That's another thing I learnt during the full disclosure interview with Mick Lynch. The idea that they've got something I haven't got obviously adds to the sense of disapproval. I can't go on strike. Quite often self-employed people might feel infuriated by industrial action because you don't really have any recourse, but you are your own employer as well, on the other hand. So if you've got a problem with your terms and conditions, talk to the boss, which is you. So it's not black and white. It's not simple, but it should be simpler than it is to see that any organisation that can protect workers from unbearably low wages and appalling terms and conditions, even if they're legal, is for the benefit of the whole of society. And it is not something that society can see. Hasn't in my entire lifetime. Matt's in Portsmouth. Matt, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning, James.
Whereabouts in Portsmouth are you? Whereabouts in Portsmouth are you?
Unfortunately, I'm in Gosport. I like to say Portsmouth because it's slightly better.
Why do you say unfortunately?
I
had a weekend away in Gosport last month.
Oh God! Why would you go there?
Well, I'm not going to go into the details, but I had quite a pleasant time.
Oh, right, okay. Well,
the high street is not the most salubrious in England, is it? It's a little bit frayed around the edges. But that cafe that does all the records, do you know the one I mean?
Yeah.
Is it Katie's Cafe or something like that?
Yeah, Katie's Cafe. Yeah, that's the badger.
That is one of the best breakfasts I have had in my life.
It's cracking down there, isn't it?
Absolutely. So you've got to big up the Gosport, Matt. Don't come in here claiming you're from Portsmouth like some sort of hyacinth bouquet.
Oh, it's better to live in a rubbish place looking at a nice place than the other way around. That's where I praise it.
Anyway, where were we? Back to industrial action.
Yeah, so I'm a big advocate for industrial action and this strike action. But looking on social media and FaceMoan, people go on about it being, with regards to Royal Mail, about the pay offer. It's actually 3.5%. And it was announced yesterday to the workers that it was essentially kill or leave it.
Yeah, I'm going to read out someone, because I think I read out the Daily Mail's analysis, which is probably a little bit loaded. So it's not a 9% pay rise. It's 5.5% this year, and only if changes are made to terms and conditions, and then a 2% lump sum on this year's pay and 1.5% next year. So you add it all up and claim that it's 9% when it clearly isn't. The strikes are more about saving Royal Mail as a business, as we all know it. The CEO wants to dismantle it and turn it into a gig economy courier company, and therefore, again, it's not just about the money, even though they misrepresent the money. It's also about protecting the nature of the job, the nature of the work done by the employees.
Exactly. And with regards to the conditions, they're trying to make posties work Sundays again after previously having that removed. They're trying to make them work less hours in the summer and every waking minute in the winter to deal with the increase in demand. They're trying to actually remove sick pay, and after a week of being on sick leave, you go on statutory sick pay.
Which takes us back to the front of The Guardian. Doctors warning that poverty is forcing sick people to keep going to work because statutory sick pay, as many people discovered when they got coronavirus outside of lockdowns, is not really enough to live on.
No, and then also what hasn't actually been publicised too much is that within a week of the managers entering negotiations with Royal Mail, there with a different union, they agreed to an 11% pay rise, and if they had 0 sick days between the date that this was agreed in mid-August and mid-October, then each manager would receive £1,500 bonus.
Gosh, yeah, divide and rule.
And then the managers get overtime pay for coming in on strike days when they have to anyway, and they get an extra day's leave for every day that they come in on strike.
I don't have the capacity while you speak to fact check everything you are saying. Neither do I have any reason.
Postie, so.
Yeah, your partner is a postie. So I was about to add, neither do I have any reason to doubt you. And these are well worn tactics, tried and trusted tactics for employers seeking to essentially corral a workforce into places that they don't want to go to. Why do you think? How old are you, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm 29.
Okay, perfect age for this question. How do you account for? You've mentioned social media. How do you account for a population of workers successfully persuaded that organisations dedicated to the interests of workers are somehow a bad thing?
I don't whatsoever. I'm a massive advocate, as I say. Of,
no, I know you are, but how do you account for the fact that lots of people aren't, even though they are workers?
So whenever you see I just try to educate. So if I see something on social media and people moan about postal workers or the RMT or whatever, I just try to say, look, just don't look at one form of news or source of information. Try and broaden your horizons and then have a discussion with someone who might actually be of a different thought process to you. And if you actually have a positive discussion about it, there may well become a positive outcome from it, and that might change their mind. You can't just go in at people lecturing them and giving them the sources of information, because then inherently your bias is then passed on to them. You've got to allow them to come to their own summation, and then you can have a proper discussion about it. That's how I try and resolve it in whatever I encounter.
Well, so do I, but I sense you're better at it than I am, because I sometimes allow my tongue to run away with me. Thank you, Matt, and I hope they give you a free milkshake in that cafe now that they've managed to secure some free national radio advertising as a consequence of your contribution to this programme. It's coming up to 11:45. Let's go to Lincolnshire. Phil's there. Phil in Crowle, what would you like to say?
Oh, morning, James. Nice to talk to you again. Well, I've been a member of a union ever since I could begin to go to work. My background, I've explained this to you in the past, actually. I told you a story a long time ago about my grandfather and experiences in the 1930s when he was sacked for being 15 minutes late because he had to run across Birkenhead to get the midwife, and then there was a stillborn baby. So I always felt, that the injustice in life, the people, the gatekeepers, the gaffers, they can be absolutely awful. I've always been a member of a union. You must always
hang on, let me pause you because I don't want to run out of time and focus you like a laser on this question, Phil. How in the course of your lifetime, your working life, have so many working people been persuaded that these organisations are somehow their enemy? How has that happened? How has it been so successful?
Right, I'm 63 next month. I've been driving a truck for 43 years. I'm one of the old school.
Yeah.
The industry is now full of youngsters, and they have been indoctrinated by the Murdoch press, by the anti-union rhetoric that we get off governments. They don't comprehend it. They cannot understand. I've told them, united you stand, divided you fall. I went up against the biggest haulage company in this country, and they said to me in a meeting, "We don't recognise unions." And I said, "You don't have to. They just recognise me, and they'll make sure you recognise employment law." And he didn't like that.
But how has it worked, is what I'm asking. How have these young people been persuaded? So they're sitting there unhappy with their lot, and yet the only means they have for improving their lot is something that they don't consider to be...
I tell you what, I don't think the unions are active enough in the workplace.
Well, it's chicken and egg, isn't it? The less members they've got, the less work they can do.
They need to be active in the workplace. You need to have a union rep somewhere. That union rep needs to be talking to these kids. You need to have meetings, but they are so apathetic towards it all. Oh, we don't Yeah, well, what good's it going to do? Oh, yeah, look what the unions did to us 40 years ago, and it wrecked the country. And no, it didn't, because what it was doing was actually protecting people. It did run away in the 1970s, and it was right to be reined in. But I listened to John Sweeney. You told me about the podcast with John Sweeney the other day, and I listened to John Sweeney talking to the Chancellor that was under Corbyn, MacDonald.
John McDonnell.
And he explained really well yesterday in that podcast how the miners' strike happened, what they did. It was a deliberate setup. It was actually almost like a military operation to destroy the miners. And
I did allude to that earlier, but it's always interesting to hear more testimony from the metaphorical coalface and indeed the real one. You've taken me up to the wire, Phil. Thank you, mate. Take care. 11:46 is the time. Well, here's a funny thing. Here I am, suggesting that the clash between workers' interests and owners' interests is best represented by how an organ like the Daily Mail attacks an individual like Mick Lynch. And guess what's been happening while we've been on air? A Daily Mail journalist has been questioning Mick Lynch.
Because of how close these strikes are to Christmas, you're being nicknamed Mick Grinch. Is that a nickname you're proud of?
Well, I expect that from yourself. That's the sort of quality journalism I've come to expect from your particular dark corner of Fleet Street. So you can call us what you want, and no doubt you will call us what you want, and you called Mr. Mosley one of the finest things that ever happened, as I remember, when you were back in the black shirt. So you can back them, you can black us. I'm not the Grinch. I'm a trade union official, and I'm determined to get a deal.
That was yesterday, actually. The Daily Mail journalist asking Mick Lynch how he feels about being called Mick Grinch. How many years at college do you think for that lad there to study chances? 11:51. Speaking about people having a bad day, I would like to sing the praises of a Conservative MP called Tim Loughton now, and there are two reasons I want to explain this to you. One is, I did a thing a few weeks ago at one of the charities closest to my heart, the Quorum. You know about Quorum, the adoption charity. And I sometimes get reminded when I'm outside the studio that there are some people doing good things in all corners of politics. Even I get a bit footballified sometimes, because Loughton is an ardent Brexiteer, or whatever phrase they use at the moment. But him and another Conservative MP called Edward Timpson, when they had responsibility for adoption as ministers, they both did amazing work. They did really good work, and Lammy has as well. Lammy has, as you probably know, David has adopted children himself, and it always reminds me when I'm at places like that having your scarf tied so tightly around your neck that you don't think anyone who plays for the other team can ever do anything decent is not only dangerous, as we constantly explain on this programme, but it's also something that you might be suffering from without realising it. So I mention that because oddly Tim Loughton was there, and I found myself reminded to remember that politicians you don't necessarily agree with about much are perfectly capable of doing amazing things. And he's just done something that I have been waiting months for someone to do. Because all of the talk of illegal immigration hinges upon, when we're talking about refugees in boats, hinges upon the idea that they have some sort of alternative, that they have some sort of choice, that they get into these boats because they're too lazy or feckless to actually come through the legal routes. And many of us have been screaming about the absence of legal routes, not just the absence of legal routes, but the deliberate closure of legal routes by successive Conservative regimes. And Tim Loughton, a Conservative MP, has finally managed to ask a Conservative Home Secretary a question that cuts to the very heart of not only this issue, but also the sort of cancerous tumour at the heart of British society that has been put there by people desperate for you to hate refugees. Have a listen to this.
Just a bit of role play. I'm a 16-year-old orphan from an East African country escaping a war zone and religious persecution. And I have a sibling legally in the United Kingdom at the moment. What is a safe and legal route for me to come to the United Kingdom?
Well, we have. You're fleeing which country? Sorry.
Any African country.
Any African country. Well,
be any continent, but let's say any African country. I don't want to name one because then their Prime Minister might have a go at me for demonising their population. So let's just theoretically talk about an African country which is going through a period of turbulence and which is persecuting its citizens, including an innocent 16-year-old like me.
Well, we have an asylum system, and people can put in applications for asylum.
How would I do that?
Well, you can do it through the safe and legal routes that we have. We have offered 390,000 places to people seeking safety from various countries around the world.
Well, I'm not Syrian, I'm not Afghan, I'm not Ukrainian, not any of those specific schemes. The Dub scheme is historic. What scheme's open to me?
Well, if you are able to get to the UK, you are able to put in an application for asylum.
But I would only enter the UK illegally then, wouldn't I?
Well, that would, if you put in your application for asylum upon arrival, that would be the process that you enter.
How could I arrive in the UK if I didn't have permission to get onto an aircraft legally to arrive in the UK?
Let me just invite other colleagues if there's anything they want to add.
I mean, you could engage with UNHCR. I mean, depending which country you're from, you could engage with UNHCR, and that would be a way of getting leave to enter the UK in order to put in an asylum claim. But I accept that there are some countries where that would not be possible.
I think the point is that there's a shortage of safe and legal routes, other than for specific groups of people that we have generously offered safe haven.
The other voice you heard was that of Matthew Rycroft, the Permanent Secretary at the Home Office, and that was amazing. I mean, I knew that was true. I knew she had nowhere to go the minute that question was asked. But how many journalists, how many radio presenters, how many commentators have you heard talking about illegal routes as if there were legal routes? Because what Suella Braverman couldn't say, which is why she swallowed her tongue so often during that clip, is that the only way for a 16-year-old orphan fleeing war to join his brother in the United Kingdom is to get in a dinghy and submit his application when he gets here. And how much of the media agenda of the last few months has been dedicated to demonising people like that? And no, he's not Albanian. He's fleeing war in East Africa with no one on this planet except his brother in the UK. How can he get here? How can he apply for asylum? Well, he can apply for asylum when he gets here. How can he get here? Well, he can't, unless he gets in a dinghy and pays a people smuggler and risks his life to do so. But anyway, here's creepy Uncle Nigel to tell you why he's a threat to your security and safety. So, Tim Loughton, fair flipping play, mate, and thank you for reminding us what decent politics looks like, because it has been a while. And that's a Conservative MP. Keir Starmer yesterday busy seeking to appease essentially racist voters who've been persuaded that immigration in general is a threat to their welfare, never mind the actual refugees coming here via the only means available to them. Well done. Thank you, Tim Loughton. I needed that. And so did my country. 11:57 is the time. Speaking of things that are sorely needed, here's Theo Usherwood.
To bring you up to date, because of course this is the first time in 2 weeks that Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak have faced each other at the dispatch box for PMQs. It's their fourth round, and it's a difficult one to predict this week. What is Keir Starmer going to go on? I would suggest he might go on housing, and of course the government's decision to abandon those targets as a
this is a rebellion, essentially.
A rebellion before he got to that point.
Fought shy of. He was threatened with a rebellion, and therefore he's abandoned the legislation, and that could set the tone for his entire premiership.
And of course, how can you go for economic growth if you can't build the houses for people to live in? And and the accusation will be, if Keir Starmer decides to raise it, or indeed any other opposition MP decides to raise it, will be that Rishi Sunak is running scared of his own backbenchers when it comes to building homes in constituencies in Greenbelt land or around the country where homes are desperately needed. But of course, he doesn't want to upset his own MPs in many of those safe seats. So Keir Starmer might well go on that particular topic. I'd imagine it's a difficult one with the immigration argument.
What about bullying?
I think that might come back. I was going to say,
he's coming back. Dominic Raab's getting accused by new people almost every day at the moment of
and there are potentially others as well.
Multiple formal complaints from the Ministry of Justice civil servants over allegations of bullying behaviour during his previous stint running the department.
So there are potentially other ministers who might be in the frame as well.
Really?
Yeah.
It's pretty slim pickings then. So possibly bullying, probably housing.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else?
There might be. I was going to say migration, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure that Keir Starmer will bring it up in the same light unless he decides to go down the route that he went down with his speech at the week.
Strikes. Wouldn't want to bring them up. He'll be accused of supporting.
I'd imagine strikes will be used by Rishi Sunak in response to many of.
Keeping an eye on the House of Commons, of course, will cross live as soon as Sir Keir Starmer gets to his feet.
So yeah, it's a difficult one for Keir Starmer. I mean, it was a slightly lacklustre PMQs last week between Dominic Raab and Angela Rayner. It wasn't perhaps what we'd come to expect, especially when those two went head to head when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister earlier in the year. So it's not a straightforward one. I'd imagine, of course, Ian Blackford will be back for the SNP. It'll be interesting to see how Rishi Sunak responds around the decision when it comes to a second independence referendum, and whether he decides to use that against Ian Blackford, or indeed if Ian Blackford raises the decision by the Supreme Court earlier today that the SNP can't hold a legitimate referendum on its.
Should we speculate on how the housing question might be framed? So essentially, 50 Tory MPs, give or take, threatened to protest over planning reform. Sunak has buckled.
Mm-hmm.
In the first real test of his parliamentary leadership, he's dropped an amendment to the Levelling Up bill that would have seen hundreds of thousands of new homes built. How would that question be phrased?
It'd be phrased around growth, economic growth.
Are you sure?
And about young people.
Not about young people who can't get on the housing ladder. Because yesterday he talked about, weaning the country off its reliance on immigration, upon bringing people into the country. I don't think he would go down that road. He's going to go down the other road about all the young people who are still living with their mum and dad.
But you have to think back to the Chesham and Amersham by-election.
Do I?
Back in the summer of 2021.
Yes.
And of course, that was a safe Conservative seat with a majority of 16,000.
And here is Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and congratulations to England and Wales on their start to the World Cup, and good luck for the rest of the tournament. Mr. Speaker, the World Cup doesn't belong to FIFA, and it doesn't belong to the host nation. It belongs to everyone who loves football. It's totally unacceptable that during this tournament, gay football fans are unable to acknowledge who they love. And players have been threatened with suspension if they show solidarity with those fans. Shame on FIFA. Yeah. Britain faces the lowest growth of any OECD nation over the next 2 years. Why?
Mr. Speaker, this country has experienced since 2010 the third highest growth in the G7. This year, the fastest growth in the G7, and unemployment at a multi-decade low. We're getting on to deliver more growth, Mr. Speaker. We're delivering free ports. We're investing in apprenticeships. We're protecting R&D. And if the Labour Party is serious about actually supporting growth, maybe they should get on the phone with their union paymasters and tell them to call off the strikes.
Mr. Speaker,
Order. We want to get through Prime Minister's questions, and you're not helping me. Keir Starmer.
He's in total denial. We're bottom of the 38 OECD countries who are all in the same boat when it comes to COVID and Ukraine. And he wants a pat on the back. It's like a football manager, bottom of the league at Christmas, celebrating an away draw 3 months ago, and it won't wash. So they don't like their record, that's the problem. So let's try it another way. Why is Britain set to be the first country into recession and the last country out?
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that the right honourable gentleman brought up the OECD report because it contained actually 3 very important points. Firstly, it made the point that actually in the years following the pandemic, we're projected to have almost the highest growth amongst our peer countries. It also made the point, it was crystal clear that the challenges we face are completely international in nature. And thirdly, Mr. Speaker, it supported our fiscal plan because it's credible and ensures sustainability. Now, the right honourable gentleman would have known all of that if he actually read the whole report. But he's not interested in substance. He's an opportunist, Mr. Speaker. In 4 weeks, Mr. Speaker. In 4 weeks, I've strengthened the economy. We've put more money into the NHS and schools. We've delivered a deal to tackle illegal migration. In the same 4 weeks, all we've...
Prime Minister, when I stand, you've got to sit down. But can I just say to you, you came to me quite rightly and said to me, we want to get through Prime Minister's questions. I'm going to give short answers. Please stick to what you have.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there's only one party that's crashed the economy and they're sitting there. And I noticed this, Mr. Speaker. I noticed this. He won't say why Britain is set to be the first into a recession and the last out. So I will. 12 years of Tory failure, followed by 12 weeks of Tory chaos. For a decade, they've let our economy drift aimlessly before suddenly cutting the parachute ropes and slamming it to the ground. And because of the changes he's made, a typical household will end up with tax increases of £1,400. They don't want to hear about these tax increases of £1,400. Contrast that to a super wealthy non-dom living here but holding their income overseas. How much more...
Order. Mr. Young, I don't need any more. I don't need shouting, don't need pointing. You're meant to be a good example when you sit on this front bench. Because you're the second, don't spoil what you're meant to do.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think they want to hear this. Because of the changes he's made, a typical household will end up paying tax increases of £1,400. Contrast that to a super wealthy non-dom living here but holding their income overseas. How much more has he asked them to pay?
Just order. As I said to the Prime Minister, I said to the Leader of the Opposition, I'm going to get through this list. I need you both to help me and think of other members. Come on.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Labour had 13 years to address this issue and did nothing. It was the Conservative government that took action and tightened the rules. But the problem with his idea is that it would end up costing Britain money. Not my words, the words of the former Labour Shadow Chancellor. But rather than peddling fairy tales and gesture politics, let's actually tell him what we're doing to deliver for this country. A record increase in the national living wage, protecting millions from energy bills, protecting the pensioners' triple lock. That's what we're doing for this country.
Mr. Speaker, if they'd grown the economy at the same rate as the last Labour government, we'd have tens of billions of pounds more to spend on that. Mr. Speaker, it wasn't a trick question. The answer is he's not asked non-doms to pay a penny more. Every year, he talks about the money. Every year, that's £3.6 billion thrown away because he won't make them pay their taxes here. How many extra doctors could Britain afford with that money?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that he brought up doctors because last week we delivered record increases in funding for the NHS. Not just more doctors, but more nurses, more scans, more operations. That shows our commitment to prioritise the NHS. Not my words, the words of the NHS Chief Executive.
Scrapping the non-dom status would allow us to train 15,000 doctors every year. That's what Labour would do. And we can carry on handing out tax breaks to the super rich. Or we can live in a society where people don't have to go private to get a doctor's appointment. It's that simple. He also hands Shell 90p for every £1 they spend drilling. So they haven't paid a penny in windfall tax. Mr. Speaker, you may have seen this week that somebody shredded £10,000 in protest at those propping up an oil and gas giant. But he shreds £10,000 every other minute propping them up. Which does he think is the more absurd?
Mr. Speaker, this is the government that has actually put in place an economic plan that will deliver confidence and stability to our economy. And all I've heard from the Honourable Gentleman today, there's no answers, there's no substance, because there's no plan, Mr. Speaker. He talks about the NHS, we're delivering record funding for the NHS, but we can only do that on the foundations of a strong economy. You can't deliver for the NHS unless you have a plan for the economy, and he doesn't have either, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, every time he opens his mouth, another powerful business voice says he hasn't got a plan on growth. The failure of the last 12 years and the chaos of the last 12 weeks are compounded by the decisions he's taking now. He won't follow Labour's plan to scrap non-dom status. Instead, we've got an NHS staffing crisis. He won't follow Labour's plan to make oil and gas giants pay their fair share. Instead, he hammers working people. And he won't push through planning reform. Instead, he kills off the dream of home ownership. Too weak to take on his party, too weak to take on vested interest, 12 long years of Tory government, 5 Prime Ministers, 7 Chancellors. Why do they always clobber working people?
Mr. Speaker, he talks about leadership. This summer, I stood on my principles and told the country what they needed to hear, even though it was difficult. When he ran for leader, he told his party what they wanted to hear. And even now, he says one thing and he does the other. He says he cares for working people, but he won't stand up to the unions. He said he'd honour Brexit, but he tried to have a second referendum. And now he tries to talk tough about immigration, but he promised to defend free movement. You can trust him to deliver for his party. You can trust me to deliver for the country.
Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we debate how to best help our constituents with their energy costs, 10 million people in Ukraine are without power due to Russia's barbaric strikes on the country's energy infrastructure. So can my right honourable friend set out what support we will be providing to our Ukrainian allies to help them repair the damage and keep their citizens warm this winter?
I'm pleased to tell my honourable friend that I spent time discussing this with President Zelensky at the weekend and talking to Ukrainian families about the impact these awful strikes are having on them. I know the whole House will be proud to know that we're providing millions of pounds of immediate support with generators, shelter and water repairs on top of the 570 mobile power generation that we are donating to power facilities across Ukraine. We're also working with the government to repair critical infrastructure with 8 projects identified by UK Export Finance to be delivered in the near future.
We now come to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in welcoming the moderator of the Church of Scotland to our proceedings this afternoon and to thank him for his sermon at St Margaret's this morning. Mr. Speaker, this morning the Supreme Court clarified a point of law, but the very point of democracy in this union is now at stake, and democracy will not be denied. Because whether Westminster likes it or not, last year the people of Scotland voted for a Scottish Parliament with a majority and the mandate to deliver an independence referendum. The Prime Minister has every right to oppose independence. He has no right to deny democracy to the people of Scotland. If the Prime Minister keeps blocking that referendum, will he at least be honest and confirm that the very idea that the United Kingdom is a voluntary union of nations is now dead and buried?
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me start by saying we respect the clear and definitive ruling of the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. And what I would say to the honourable gentleman, that firstly, I am looking forward to also seeing the moderator of Scotland tomorrow. And I think that the people of Scotland want us to be working on fixing the major challenges that we collectively face, whether that's the economy, supporting the NHS, or indeed supporting Ukraine. Now is the time for politicians to work together, and that's what this government will do.
Ian Blackford.
Mr. Speaker, it is right that we respect the decision of the court. But the Prime Minister can't claim to respect the rule of law and then deny democracy in the very same breath. If democracy is to matter, if elections matter, then mandates matter. Since 2014, the Scottish National Party has won 8 elections in a row. Last year, we won a landslide. The Scottish Parliament now has the biggest majority for an independence referendum in the history of devolution. The Prime Minister doesn't even have a personal mandate to sit in 10 Downing Street. What right does a man with no mandate have to deny Scottish democracy?
But, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to Scottish democracy, I'm pleased that the Scottish Government has one of the most powerful devolved assemblies anywhere in the world. And I'm pleased, and I was pleased very shortly after becoming Prime Minister to be the first Prime Minister in over a decade to attend the Council, to sit down with the First Minister, to explore ways in which we can work together with the Scottish Government to deliver for the people of Scotland. Whether that's delivering our growth deals, delivering free ports, or ensuring that the £1.5 billion of extra Barnet money can go towards supporting public services, that's what we're committed to doing in Scotland.
Gareth Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, last month, Just Stop Oil clambered up the Dartford crossing, causing chaos for days. They then attacked artworks, the M25, and anything else to cause misery and mayhem. These people are not
17 minutes after 12 is the time. We'll pick over the bones of PMQs with Theo Usherwood after this. 20 minutes after 12 is the time. Dee in Warrington says, is it just me? But when I listened to Rishi Sunak just then, I heard Boris Johnson. I know what you mean, Dee in Warrington. I thought that was Rishi Sunak's best performance yet at PMQs, although the bar to clear was remarkably low. But he did pursue, I would argue, the Boris Johnson trick of just repeating, at the very least, questionable claims of success ad infinitum, while failing utterly to answer any questions that Keir Starmer asked. But I'd say, again, that was probably his best yet. Theo's here.
I'd agree. And funnily enough, he didn't mention Jeremy Corbyn in any of
which
his
he does
reports.
when he's desperate.
Which he does, and he's done the previous.
Been persuaded not to do that anymore because he's seen how it's landed.
Yeah, exactly. And he's now dropped that one.
Also, Corbyn keeps complaining about it quite officially, I think.
So, but I think it's notable that actually he just stuck to the arguments about the economy rather than trying to turn it into a historic attack on Keir Starmer's record, where actually people were sort of watching it going, well, that's not quite...
He did do quite a lot of historic attacks on Keir Starmer's record.
Not as much, no, but in terms of...
He talked about the second referendum, he talked about support for, or a failure to stand up to unions. Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah, in terms of Corbyn, yes.
Well, the second referendum popped up again, but not the last Labour leader.
Yes. And Keir, you were right. Can I say that? It's really painful too.
Right, there's a book.
Yes, it was really annoying because you were right, because Keir Starmer did mention housing briefly, but he didn't link it to growth. He talked about Rishi Sunak taking away the dream of home ownership, and of course
for people currently living with their mums and dads.
Yeah,
yeah. Go me.
No. Anyway. But of course, Keir Starmer did talk about economic growth. He made a great play of economic growth. The fact that we were first into recession, we're going to be last out of recession. But of course, he doesn't ever link it to Brexit. He never talks about, and as Rachel Reeves, the Shadow
It's
Chancellor.
beginning to look silly, that now. I mean, it looked like the right thing to do when he first did it.
But he won't do it.
But, you know, have you seen the story about the gammon plant opening?
No, you're putting.
I'm not. I swear to you, this is even the Daily Telegraph's own headline. So you can't even accuse me of being cheeky. The Daily Telegraph has put this headline on the story: Danish Crown to build £100 million gammon plant in UK despite Brexit red tape. So the European pork producer is to build a £100 million gammon and bacon factory in the UK despite facing a mountain of post-Brexit red tape. It will be in Rochdale. And the company have said that they had to fill in 33,000 pages of paperwork in addition to what they would have done if they'd opened this facility before Brexit. Yes. And so the ridiculousness of neither party leader ever mentioning it as a cause of making our economy less productive is becoming almost Kafkaesque.
Yes, but you can't do that because, well, Rishi Sunak can't do that because we saw the noises off that came from the European Research Group about being un-British, about being off the wall Remainer. If you were to, when there are soundings mooted within the Treasury from Jeremy Hunt and the Chancellor, that actually we might have to seek some sort of closer ties with the European Union, which of course is impossible to do in terms of moving to a Swiss-style model unless you accept freedom of movement, because that's a condition of the single market.
They still don't get it. I exchanged some messages with Pete Foster yesterday of the FT, who covers this, as you know, comprehensively, and we're both opining that it is absolutely unbelievable that they still think they can march in there and demand unique treatment, demand special circumstances. They can pick and choose. They still think, it's like David Davis saying that the day after the result will be in Berlin, negotiating directly with the German government, which is literally against the rules. They still think they can go in there and do some sort of thing that no other country would be allowed to do because, you know, rule Britannia waives the rules.
So
remarkable, frankly, even after all this time. Have you seen the Owen Paterson story?
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, carry on. We'll come to that.
I have. But of course, what Keir Starmer's trying to do, James, is he's trying to steer away from this narrative that's obviously coming from the Conservative government, that somehow the economic situation we are in at the moment is down to global factors such as the war in Ukraine, of course leading to higher prices. This is the argument from the Conservatives, and trying to put it down to, as he says, mismanagement of the government for the past 12 years, their failure to promote and stimulate economic growth. And that's why we are in the situation now. But of course, he does that without talking about Brexit, because Labour can't be seen to say, well, actually leaving the European Union in 2016 or voting to leave the European Union in 2016 was a bad idea.
OK, this is what I'd do.
What would you do?
Just call it the Tory Brexit.
But then you get to the situation, and this is what Keir Starmer said, of making Brexit work.
Yeah.
So how do you make Brexit work, James?
That will be in my manifesto.
Really? But you must have an idea, you must have an idea about how you'd make Brexit work.
Yeah, I do.
What is that idea? What would you do?
It goes to a different school.
Sorry?
Goes to a different school.
Brexit goes to a different...
No, my Brexit idea is brilliant, but it goes to a different school.
But you have to make Brexit work. How do you make Brexit work so that people don't, like this Danish gammon factory, they don't have to fill in 33,000 pages.
Don't be racist.
Let me be clear. Bureaucracy.
Let me be clear. We will make Brexit work.
Yes, okay, how?
By making Brexit work.
But you're not going to accept free movement. You're not going to go for membership of the single market. You're not going to go for a Swiss-style model. But we're not going to have 33,000 pages of paperwork if you want to set up a factory in Rochdale.
Let me be clear. We will make Brexit work.
So is this now demonstrating why Keir Starmer might not want to talk about Brexit?
Let me be clear. Yes. So he can't mention it at all. So I nicked that suggestion off a texter. Why doesn't Starmer just say this Tory Brexit? Because I thought it was quite a clever intervention, but you've just rather winningly demonstrated that it wouldn't work if he said this Tory Brexit, because immediately we would say, well, what does yours look like?
Exactly.
Is there anything you can do? Is there anything that could be done to improve? Because I read in the Telegraph today that Apparently some Remainers spend a lot of time saying, I told you so, and that's the real reason things are going so badly. So what could good old-fashioned patriotic Remainers who are watching their every prediction come horribly true, what could they be doing in order to improve the relationship with the European Union while the red lines you've just described remain in place? Is there anything at all? I mean, this is why politics is in such a weird place. I'm a national authority on Brexit, and I don't know the answer to that question. What could you do? How could you improve the relationship without crossing any of the red lines that have been in place since Theresa May was...
Well, you could improve there's two different things there, isn't there? There's improving the relationship, and then there's securing a rule change that would make Britain completely separate from everybody else.
Yeah.
So
but we're not going to align with EU rules, so we can never improve trade then. We can never reduce red tape.
No.
So what? I mean, there's no.
I don't know whether we can take them at present.
I mean, this is good live radio because I think that we're arriving at the conclusion that there is nothing. Rachel Reeves has said this conservative Brexit, but you know.
But what's the alternative? What does
I don't know.
She said on LBC last week that rejoining the single market, that ship has sailed.
Yes.
That was definitive. We're not going to rejoin the single market. So with that would come freedom of movement and the other.
And that was the other thing Sunak did today, of course, was to talk about freedom of movement, like abolishing it was a good thing. I mean, abolishing freedoms, you must celebrate the abolition of your freedoms. It's a remarkable flex, and it's still there. But this is something we shall explore further together. Is there anything? Because actually none of the commentators have moved on to this. Everyone talks in quite vague terms about the need to improve the relationship, whether they're Leavers, vaguely sensible or regretful Leavers, and Remainers who are being proved horribly right about everything.
But the arguments that have been put to those who voted for Brexit and campaigned for Brexit and still want Brexit is that you have to make it work and to make it work better.
So how? Everyone should be answering this question because Labour pretend that it's improvable when I think deep down they know that it isn't. Brexiters are still waiting for their unicorns when some of them at least must now recognise that unicorns don't exist. So we're not rejoining any element, whether it's EFTA or single market or customs union or even EEA. As soon as they mention talk of a Swiss one, they have to put out a caveat saying, no, we'll get all the benefits without the freedom of movement, which is a bloody benefit, but that ship has sailed. What would a tweak look like to improve the current situation?
Well, the EU say you can't cherry pick.
Yeah.
So you can't take the good bits, like not having to fill in 33,000 pages of paperwork, and then say, well, actually, we don't want freedom of movement. So that's the problem.
That's the next chapter of this conversation, then. We've just preempted it.
But what Keir Starmer's trying to do is trying to pin the current economic climate, the situation we're in, and the fact that people are facing higher bills, whether it's their energy, their fuel, inflation at the supermarket, without mentioning Brexit, but pin it on the government.
Very tricky. And again, I'll just read this out. It's interesting that you think this was Rishi Sunak's best performance yet. I was listening and thought he sounded desperate and like a sixth form debater, desperate to insult his opponent, but maybe I am biased. No, you're right. He did, but it was still his best performance ever. He did sound like a sixth form debater desperately insulting his opponent, but it was his best performance yet because the previous two have been so awful. Three, sorry. Anything else? Any other business? What about the Owen Paterson story?
Oh, the Owen Paterson.
Should we do it after the news?
Yeah, if you want to, yeah.
Amelia Cox is here now with the headlines. 12:35 is the time. Do you know that Theo and I haven't stopped talking since we went to the news? We just carried on, and I won't be able to remember if you bump into me after I finish today and you say, was that on air or off air? I won't be able to remember. Will you?
Yes, I will, because there were two distinct conversations, James.
Were there?
One is not in front of a live microphone.
See, this is what I was hoping you'd say, because we should do a red button or something. We should do like an editor's cut, a director's cut. So we moved from the Gammon Factory in Rochdale.
Yes.
Some people suggesting...
No, don't do this.
No, all right.
Don't do this.
Okay. To Owen Paterson, ardent Brexiteer. I used to hate the phrase ardent Brexiteer because I felt that it made them sound sort of romantic or like musketeers or something. But now it's just dripping with absurdity. I use it with great glee.
One of those white, you told me off repeatedly during the
because at the time it made them sound.
They were like cavaliers, and
but it made them sound like that at the time. It made them sound like the D'Artagnan of sovereignty. But now you say ardent Brexiteer, and it's just like being called a nincompoop, a raving nincompoop. Anyway, ardent Brexiteer Owen Paterson is in the news. Theo Ushwood, pray, why might that be?
So do you remember this time last year, Owen Paterson, who of course former Environment Secretary, was found to have repeatedly broken the rules when it came to paid advocacy.
I do remember it now you come to mention it, because shortly after that, Jacob Rees-Mogg masterminded an attempt to get Owen Paterson off the hook by ripping up all of the rules that he had actually broken, and it went so well, Owen Paterson ended up out of the House of Commons completely, and many would argue that the hole below Boris Johnson's waterline started letting in water that would eventually sink him completely.
It was the first scandal, wasn't it?
Oh, happy days.
Paterson, now, of course, this is a man who once argued that the European Union UK should break free from the
Can you
ECHR.
tell when I tell Theo to hurry up? Because he actually hurries up. He says the same number of words in a smaller amount of time. Other broadcasters, when you say hurry up, they say fewer words in the available time.
Me.
No, I know, but Lewis Goodall is here. And we've got you.
Just bear with us.
You're waving at him aggressively. I don't blame him.
You can be quiet as well. For God's sake, what do you think this is? Some sort of communist arrangement? Sorry, Theo, where were we?
Owen Paterson once argued the UK should break free from the ECHR. He has now filed a case to the EHCR that his respect for private life has been broken under the Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights.
So he's suing the British government in the European Court of Human Rights.
Yes, he is, because it came to light. He lost his job because he had to stand down as an MP. Because of paid advocacy, broke lobbying rules, and he said that should never have been put into the public domain or never found its way into the public domain, and therefore he is suing the British government.
So ardent Brexiteer and sworn enemy of the European Court of Human Rights is suing the British government in the European Court of Human Rights. Theo, thank you.
Thank you.
Lewis Goodall is here because I caught a glimpse of a report you have done for the Newsagents podcast looking at poverty. I was struck by two things: the power of the report, and I knew you were a Brummie, but I didn't realise you grew up in Northfield.
I did, yeah.
And it is to there that you returned.
It was there that I went, because Well, look, I mean, Northfield, most people wouldn't know it. If they know it at all, it's because of a component of it, which is Longbridge, which is, of course, the site of the old Rover factory, gone now. My dad used to work there. And it is, it's a very ordinary place in lots of ways. I don't mean that in a pejorative way. It's just like a lot of places a lot of listeners would know. And like so many places in Britain, over the last 10 years, 15 years, it has become home to something which it might have known in pockets, but has become so much more widespread, which is real poverty. And the thing that strikes me so much about our politics again and again at the moment is, and over a longer period, is how normalised that's become. Not just poverty, but extreme poverty, in a way that was once, even relatively recently, at the fringes of our society. It's now just so ubiquitous. So even the example of food bank, it's just become part of the lexicon, the political vocabulary. And now we've added on this extraordinary thing, warm bank. Yeah. And I think the danger is that we just, and in a sense, thank goodness, as I say in the report, thank goodness these places exist, because without this kind of infrastructure of poverty, people would be absolutely destitute, and goodness knows what situation they'd be in. But the very fact that they exist, and so widespread, and we all just sort of shrug our shoulders and get on with it, I think is part of the problem.
Or we don't not register it at all, actually.
Yeah.
Even though it's being normalised, it's only being normalised for the people for whom it's being normalised.
Indeed.
For everybody else, it's out of sight, out of mind.
Indeed. So we went along to one of Northfield's now longest established warm banks. It's been going for about 6 months. And people go once a week and, they just go for somewhere to sit and talk and have a hot meal, but also to be warm and to charge their phones. And it's run by volunteers, like so many of these places are. And we spoke to a teacher who's volunteered there, and I think what she told us really encapsulates exactly what I've been saying, which is the idea that poverty, once confined to a reasonably sizable fringe, but nonetheless is just expanding. And she was talking about how that manifests itself with the kids at her school.
I've been coming here for over a year now doing this. And we went from, I reckon, about 12, 15 people. Tonight is a quiet night, but last week we had 68 people here. I think the figures speak for themselves.
Like, why is that? I mean, why is it that we're in a situation where basically, even if you're working, you're getting a good income, you can't even get the basics? Like, there's got to be something fundamentally wrong, hasn't there?
Yes, of course there is. And that's why poverty is affecting, I think, more and more families. And I teach in schools. I teach across the city as well. And I see that day in, day out. Like, you might see sort of grubby collars, You might see like the coat definitely hasn't been washed for a long time because they can't afford the washing powder. They can't afford the electric to do that in the first place.
Where does it go, Lewis?
I don't know, James, because I think that so many of the central problems of our politics basically orbit around this point, which is that it was once broadly true to say, if you go back 15 years or so, that if you were in poverty, you were most likely not to be in work.
Yeah.
You were probably quite unlikely to be in poverty if you were in work. And now, huge numbers of people who are in work are in real poverty. And that just speaks to a broken system, a broken economic system. Wages aren't high enough. The state is in the situation where it has to step in consistently. Because resources are ever more stretched by the state can't do that particularly effectively. And on the cycle goes. And, housing is another great example of it. Look how much money the state spends on housing and housing benefit just to prop up, give people somewhere to live and to be, and the enormous amounts of money going to private landlords and so on and so forth. So I don't know. I just think that, in a sense, what we've got to do, the first step has got to be to recognise that something very fundamental is broken with our economic and political model.
And that recognition seems a way off. Oddly, you come in off the back of another PMQs where the Prime Minister spent an awful lot of time claiming that we're in clover.
Well, I mean, I think that this is probably a danger for Sunak and the Conservatives, right?
Yeah.
Which is that, and it's the tension of their position, right? Because on the one hand, Sunak wants to be able to sort of say, well, look, I've come in off the back of this brief sort of disaster period, which albeit was part of my own party. But at the same time, it's very, very difficult because whatever the kind of particular policy situation is, whether it's about asylum, whether it's about, the economy or the broken economic model we were just talking about, fundamentally, we're talking about a government which is 12 years old. Even though we've had so much churn in Prime Minister, it might not always feel like that.
Johnson somehow managed to
Johnson was just so
himself.
mercurial
Yeah.
and was sort of able to, but Sunak is a more establishment figure, so he's struggling with that. And, it represents that dilemma, which is on the one hand, do you recognise this profound economic malaise that we're in, and therefore not seem a bit balmy because at least you're recognising it. But in so doing, you're basically accepting the fact that this is happening on our watch, and who is responsible? So it's one of those just symptoms and difficulties of being in government for a long time.
Lewis, thank you very much. You can hear Lewis Goodall's full report on the poverty. I still struggle to say the word so casually, which is kind of the point you're making about normalisation, isn't it, in Northfield? But of course, it is merely representative of a much broader problem on the Newsagents podcast, which drops every afternoon and is, of course, presented by Lewis, Emily Maitlis and John Sopel. You can download it download the Global Player app and then get hold of all of your LBC shows and the best podcasts in the world. Thank you, Lewis. 12:44 is the time. I am going to have to play you that Tim Loughton clip again before I go home because I think it is one of the most important interventions in the largely rancid refugee conversation that the country has had inflicted upon it in recent months. But I also want to get to the bottom of the egg shortages that are sweeping through supermarkets, with Marks and Spencer's and Morrison's now joining Tesco, Asda and Lidl with egg rationing, which is not apparently a consequence of bird flu. So we talked about it in the office yesterday and everyone said, bird flu. Not in that tone of voice, that would be weird. But I saw a clip on socials, and when someone says the mainstream media are ignoring this, 9 times out of 10 I go, yeah, because you're crackers. But 1 in every 10 I go, yeah, you're right, I haven't actually, I mean, I've read about it, but I don't actually get it. I don't know what the story is. Well, we will find out what the story is before handing over to Sheila Fogarty at 1 o'clock. 12:49 is the time, and I think a bit of an idiot's guide now to egg shortages, because and I am the idiot. Thankfully, we have an expert on the line. Johan Humphreys is a 4th-generation farmer in Mid Wales, and the estate includes chicken farming and egg farming. You'll know, Johan, that Marks and Spencer's and Morrison's have now joined Tesco, Asda and Lidl to restrict the number of boxes that shoppers may buy. Let's begin at the beginning. What's going on?
So the cost to produce a dozen eggs is far greater than the price we are getting paid for that dozen eggs. So producers simply can't afford to continue producing the eggs, so are not restocking their sheds. They're just leaving their sheds empty.
I see. So What's the average laying life of a hen, if you don't mind me asking?
So my hens will be until about 82 weeks.
Okay.
I don't know what's like a year and a half.
So there's been quite a long process here then. So with energy prices going up, presumably and inflation, that's why the cost of producing the eggs is rising. And then when a chicken reaches the end of its laying life, it's not financially viable for you to replace it.
No. So I'm a 32,000 bird unit.
Yes.
The price of birds have gone up £1 a bird. So that's costing me an extra 32,000 just to put new birds in the shed. Yeah.
Okay. And that means that the number of eggs reaching supermarkets is falling, even as the price of eggs goes up. So 50p on average since the beginning of the year for a dozen eggs, of which farmers are only getting 18 pence per box.
Yeah. If you're one of the lucky farmers, yeah.
What do you mean by that? Is that some aren't even getting that?
Some aren't, yeah. So, the average cost of production is anywhere from £1.20 to £1.40 to produce a dozen eggs.
Yeah.
We're getting paid about £1.09. So, yeah.
Well, look, you don't need to be Carol Vorderman to work out that that's unsustainable. So all of the eggs in the background, actually, I've just remembered them on the radio, but I can actually see Johan at the moment, and there are some pallets, and lots of pallets of eggs in the background. They are being produced currently at a loss.
Yeah, so there's about 80,000 eggs on the pallets there behind me, and it's costing me more to produce them than I'm getting paid for them. Yeah.
And of course, if you were to withhold those eggs from the supermarket as a form of leverage, then the financial hit you would take would be epic.
Humongous, yeah. So the birds have still got to eat.
Yeah.
They're going through about 30 tonne of feed a week. My feed went up from £250 a tonne to £400 a tonne. Yeah,
that is it. I get it. I completely understand it. What I don't understand is how the hell this ends. Because unless the supermarkets considerably increase the price of eggs and pass it on to the farmers, this situation, you're all going to go bust eventually. It's just a question of when, not if. Or at least the egg production side of your business will go under.
Yeah, so the supermarkets they've raised the price for the consumer.
Yeah.
The consumer is already paying more, but we haven't seen that price come up with us, at the same level of knots as, our production costs have gone up. And at the end of the day, we're not withholding eggs. We want to produce eggs. It's just we can't afford to.
That's the bit I wanted to get to. And bird flu, has that played a role in this at all?
It has a bit in the country. I'm in Wales, so my birds are still out. They're still free range. They're roaming around. About 2 million birds have been culled due to bird flu. 8 million birds haven't been ordered into laying flocks because people can't afford. So I don't know which is the biggest issue there, the 2 million culled or the 8 million that haven't been.
Yeah, so the economics of it are 400% a bigger problem than the bird flu, and obviously bird flu will go away again, whereas the economic problems are not showing any sign of disappearing over the horizon anytime soon. Are you worried? I can't quite see how this ends really at the minute, unless the supermarkets make some serious changes.
Well, yeah. Well, there was bird flu last year, and we didn't have an egg shortage.
Exactly.
But yeah, we're all worried, as egg producers. It's not sustainable as it is. We're going to have a lot more sit-down talks. To try and figure out a fair price for a great British product,
Well, of course it is. Thank you, mate. And I don't know if you heard my introduction. Normally when I see someone on social media moaning about the mainstream media ignoring them, I think they're nuts. But on your occasion, I think you had a very valid case, and I'm very happy to have helped you get it out there.
I don't know. I am a little bit nervous.
We'll talk again, and do keep in touch, Yo, and let us know if you need a platform or you need a bit of amplification in any later stages of this dispute, this issue.
Fabulous. Thank you very much.
Joan Humphreys there, speaking live from his farm in mid Wales with 80. I was going to sound like Alan Partridge now. I nearly said with 80,000 eggs behind him. Extraordinary. Suella Braverman, have we got the second clip? Is it worth listening to, or should we play the first one again? What are we thinking? Well, anyway, I'm going to play the first one again because this is. Have we got the second one? No. So this is stunning. This is so important, and probably, I imagine, I don't want to put words in any other presenters' mouths, but I will certainly be coming at this issue afresh tomorrow, or almost certainly be coming at this issue afresh tomorrow, because it is Thursday, so that's 1 hour of the show already accounted for. But just think about everybody you've heard use the word illegal, from the Prime Minister down, and some of us sitting here going, it's not illegal. It's not illegal. It only becomes illegal after your application has been processed. You've been adjudged to have no right to be here, and you abscond. You're not an illegal immigrant if you are in a dinghy crossing the channel, desperate for asylum. You arguably become illegal if that application fails. But just listen to Tim Liotta talking to the hideous Home Secretary, morally hideous Home Secretary, Suella Braverman.
Just a bit of role play. I'm a 16-year-old orphan from an East African country escaping a war zone and religious persecution. And I have a sibling legally in the United Kingdom at the moment. What is the safe and legal route for me to come to the United Kingdom?
Well, we have... you're fleeing which country, sorry?
Any African country.
Any African country. Well...
Be any continent, but let's say any African country. I don't want to name one because then their Prime Minister might have a go at me for demonising their population. So let's just theoretically talk about an African country which is going through a period of turbulence and which is persecuting its citizens, including an innocent 16-year-old like me.
Well, we have an asylum system and people can put in applications for asylum.
How would I do that?
Well, you can do it through the safe and legal routes that we have. We have offered 390,000 places to people seeking safety from various countries around the world.
I'm not Syrian, I'm not Afghan, I'm not Ukrainian, not any of those specific schemes. The Dub scheme is historic. What scheme's open to me?
Well, if you are able to get to the UK, you are able to put in an application for asylum.
But I would only enter the UK illegally then, wouldn't I?
Well, that would, if you put in your application for asylum upon arrival, that would be the process that you enter.
How could I arrive in the UK if I didn't have permission to get onto an aircraft legally to arrive in the UK?
Let me just invite other colleagues if there's anything they want to add.
I mean, you could engage with UNHCR. I mean, depending which country you're from, you could engage with UNHCR, and that would be a way of getting leave to enter the UK in order to put in an asylum claim. But I accept that there are some countries where that would not be possible.
I think the point is that there's a shortage of safe and legal routes, other than for specific groups of people that we have generously offered safe haven.
So there it is. After months of truly despicable journalism and utterly appalling politics, the Conservative Home Secretary forced by her Conservative colleague Tim Liotta to acknowledge, or as near as damn it, that the only way for a genuine refugee fleeing war and seeking succour with his only living relative on this planet is to get in a death-trap dinghy in Calais, hand over his life savings to a people smuggler and entrust his very existence to the vicissitudes of the English Channel. And it has been deliberately created by Suella Braverman and Tim Loughton's party. It has been deliberately constructed to appease the chomping mob of racists still refusing to apologise for the Brexit debacle that they've inflicted upon all of us. Congratulations and thank you to Tim Loughton, who I will now be bombarded, no doubt, with information about why I shouldn't be so nice about him. But for now, thank you. Oh, hang on. I've already reminded you today that you can download the show on Global Player. You'll find all LBC's shows there, as well as the world's biggest podcasts. Tom Swarbrick will be with you at 4. And Sheila Fogarty is with you now.
I'm here right now.
He is with you now.
I'm here right now.
He is with you now.
I'm here right now.
He is with you now.
I'm here right now.
He is with you now.
I'm here right now.
He is with you now.
I'm here right now.
He is with you now.
I'm here right now.
He is with you now.
I'm here right now.
He is with you now.
I'm here right now.
He is with you now.
I'm here right now.
He is with you now.
I'm here right now.
He is with you now.
I'm here right now.
He is with you now.
I'm here right now.
He is with you now.
I'm here